Hey guys, kinggath here with Bethesda Mod School. So in this lesson, we're going to go over what makes an NPC attack, because this is something I think most people who have started to mess with NPCs run into. Feels like a brick wall because it doesn't seem to make any sense. So if you are the type of person that can learn just by reading all of this stuff, you can learn all of what I'm going to show in this tutorial by checking out the creationkit.com site. There is detailed information on factions and the AI data tab, which are the two things we're going to go over because the two are very closely related, even though you wouldn't think that they are. So these two are tied together. We're going to talk about all of that. Now, before we go forward with that, and before we send any of you free who are happy to learn via text, know with one thing with creationkit.com site, I mentioned this before, but it's worth reiterating, especially for this particular thing, is that a lot of the information for Fallout 4 is actually not available on the Fallout 4 side of the creation wiki. So if you ever find that you're searching for a topic on creationkit.com and you're not getting any results under Fallout 4, if you go back to creationkit.com, you'll drop at a landing page where you can choose between Fallout and Skyrim. If you choose Skyrim and search again, you'll actually get different information. And so AI data tab is one of those where it's documented well on the Skyrim side and not so much on the Fallout 4 side. And you'll find a lot of information that's very useful that I'm going to use heavily in this tutorial. So one of the things that's worth sticking around this particular lesson with, and I shouldn't even call this a tutorial, this is 100% a lesson. I've actually been using the term lesson a lot because I know I'm not going to get to tutorial style stuff in all of these, and I tend to talk a lot more than show in my series. But one thing to know with this lesson is we're not actually going to do anything. We're really just going to learn a lot of things. So I'm going to do little things in here, but with no intention of saving them, just for the sake of demonstrating some stuff. So we're in the creation kit now, and I've just got a lot of random forms open, and this is just things that I want to show you guys. But the things we're going to cover here are the faction form, and we're not even going to cover everything. I'm only going to talk about crime in general. The ranks tab, I'll just tell you, is virtually unused in Fallout 4. And the vendor we'll do a whole tutorial on, and I'll walk you through setting up a custom vendor because it's very useful. And it's all done. A lot of the ways vendors behave, which containers they use, which stuff they'll buy. It's actually all controlled on factions, which is very odd. You would think that there would be some separate vendor thing, but Bethesda determined it should be tied to factions. So we'll cover that in another tutorial. So let's focus on general crime and the AI data tab of actors. We're also going to briefly talk about the factions tab on NPCs, just because that's kind of worth knowing. And I'll just cover that right now. And that's that if you want an NPC to naturally be in a faction right out of the gate without you having to do any scripting or anything like that, you just go to their AI data tab, their factions tab, and you can just right click here and hit new, and you can add additional factions so that NPC acts like a member of that faction. So that's all I want to show you with factions tab for NPCs. So we'll slide this aside and we'll stick with AI data tab. So AI data is heavily tied in with the factions. Now I'm going to go over AI data last because I think the AI data stuff is where I'm going to focus more on. So I'm going to just go over a few little quirks and things with factions. So factions can be very frustrating because of a couple of things about them. First off is that there aren't really predefined rules game-wide that explain the way factions work. So if you look at a list like the Raider faction, if we look at their list of factions in their inter-faction relationships category, you'll see that there's this section under combat where you have these 4 different types. And you can see now when I have one selected down at the bottom here, it shows a group combat reaction. It shows these 4 types. My assumption when I first looked at this was that there were default behavior for ally, enemy, friend, and neutral, when in fact there's not. Instead, those are kind of categories, and then it uses those categories along with the AI data settings to determine whether or not an NPC should attack. But beyond that, the factions don't really have a lot of impact. In fact, 2 NPCs in the same faction aren't even naturally allies with each other. It's very strange. And so once you get that thing figured out, it makes the rest of this a lot easier to understand. So lesson 1 here is that just because an NPC is in a faction, it does not necessarily mean that they're friendly even with members of that same faction. That's very strange. So what you'll find if you look at Bethesda's factions, almost every one of them follows this pattern, and that's that you will find under the interfaction relations an entry of that same faction listed. Now, if I tried to do that with my custom faction I have here, that I just started creating, I will find that my faction isn't actually listed. So what you actually have to do to get your faction to show up so that you can do that is you actually have to hit OK and save your faction. So we're going to go ahead and hit OK here. I'm actually working in the deployable turrets mod. I'll have to just roll back without saving, and that's fine. So let's go back and bring up my KG test here, and we'll go to character and then faction. And now if I go to this menu, and you can click on any drop-down list and start typing in, you'll see that now my faction is available. So that's the first thing. You do have to hit OK on your faction form before it'll show up in the list. So one of the first things I do, if it's a faction I intend on giving multiple NPCs, I'm going to want to set up a record of that same faction as an ally. So now, if I put my NPCs in my KG test faction, they will be friendly with other NPCs in KG test faction. So that's a weird thing you wouldn't think of. And that one tripped me up very early on, and I ran into problems with that. All right, so the next odd thing with factions is the fact that if you make a faction friendly to yours, it will not necessarily be reciprocated. So for example, in my test faction, I have made the Raider factions an ally. So if I were to give an NPC a test faction and drop them next to a Raider that was in the Raider faction, my NPC would not engage with the Raiders because they're flagged as an ally. But the Raiders would still start attacking my NPC because it does not reciprocate automatically. And this is important to know because of the fact that you really can't edit the vanilla factions. It's a very big problem. So you can't realistically come into every single faction and add KG test faction as an ally. That would break all sorts of mods. Every other mod that tried to do the same thing would not be compatible, and you would end up with just dozens of mod patches of patches to deal with this. It would be a real nightmare. So I highly recommend nobody messes with the vanilla factions. Just leave those alone, or you risk just causing untold numbers of conflicts for various mods. So instead, you have to do some tricks. So there are multiple ways, and I would still recommend you set up allies like this. So for example, if I want my test faction to be friendly to the Raiders, it's still valuable to put that in, even though it's not reciprocated, just so that at least my NPCs aren't the cause of starting engagement. It just makes it easier for what you have to control, because what you end up having to do to control this is you end up having to use quest aliases, which we haven't covered yet, so I'm not even going to talk about that yet, or more likely you're going to have to use scripts to do this stuff. So then what you end up having to do is dynamically at runtime change faction relationships or add NPCs into factions temporarily with scripts so that they take care of that. And so then you end up having, if you only have to do that for one of the factions instead of both, that's just going to save you a lot of time. So again, we haven't gotten into scripting and adding factions, so I'm not going to cover that in particular, but just know that all of this stuff, so the factions combat relation to each other, that can be changed at runtime with scripts. You can add NPCs to new factions at runtime with scripts, and you can also change all of this AI, or most of this AI data information at runtime with scripts. So scripts are very powerful, and one of the things that you'll quickly find out when you're modding is a ton of stuff that's done in real time during the game is actually done through scripting. So scripting is something I think pretty much every modder needs to learn. If you want to take it seriously, you're going to have to learn some basic scripting, which is why I'm very excited to continue with that scripting series, and we'll get back to it soon. But you're going to end up needing to do random little scripting, especially if you want to do any type of thing that evolves with the player. So if you want to do any type of quest gameplay, or if you want to introduce some sort of new system that changes things over time, you're almost always going to have to do some basic scripting. And so you can script all this stuff to change. But one way you can avoid having to do that, where you want your NPC to be friendly with another faction, the easiest way to do that is to just actually put them in that faction. And so you could do that right on the NPC tab. So if we went back to the faction, you can actually just add your NPCs to the Raider faction to make sure they were friendly to it, because we know that most of Bethesda's factions have themselves as an ally. That's just a reasonable way to do that. Now, obviously, that can have some unintended consequences. And that's because you might find that some other faction has the Raider faction, as our example here, listed as an enemy. And then so because we put ourselves or our NPCs into that Raider faction, then any NPC or any faction that has Raider flags as an enemy will now view our NPC as an enemy. Now, as far as I can tell, enemy basically trumps everything else. So if any of your factions are such that they are an enemy with an NPC, then all of the other faction relationships are thrown out the window. I have found examples where that's not the case, and I found examples where that is the case. And so it seems to be the game engine's very finicky about stuff like that. And so that's another thing where you have to be careful. And your best bet is to lean on being very minimalist. And you'll see that Bethesda follows this pattern is don't just put in every potential faction that you might want to be friendly with as an ally, because then you create a potential mess where it's very hard to control situations that are dynamic. Because that's one of the things with Bethesda games that I think we all love and that we might take for granted here is that a lot of the best moments in Bethesda games tend to come up because they've set up stuff like this. They've set up all these dynamic relationships and things where it's not scripted. So then you can end up with scenarios where, for example, like the Minutemen roll in and the Brotherhood are also there and they don't kill each other. Instead, they both go after the Raiders. And the reason for this is because they tend to lean on the fact that every faction is naturally neutral to each other. So it's only after you start specifically identifying factions as enemies or allies that it can change the behavior. So by default, everybody's already neutral to each other. And neutral doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to start attacking each other. Neutral tends to mean they're just going to leave each other alone. It means they won't jump into combat when they're under attack, and they're also not going to attack you just because you attacked them. So, for example, if we had the way I said that was kind of weird. Let's say, for example, that you have the Minutemen and the Brotherhood and the Raiders all standing in a room together. The Minutemen and the Brotherhood would start killing the Raiders, and then if you as the player started attacking one of the Minutemen would turn on you, but the Brotherhood would not, because the Brotherhood and Minutemen are neutral to each other. They don't actually care what you do to the other faction, but they also aren't going to attack each other. So they will work together against the Raiders, but they're not going to protect each other from damage done by some other neutral party or some other friendly party like the player. And so that is one of those things where factions can get interesting and where you should lean toward neutral when possible, unless you specifically have a reason you need to make them allies. And usually when you're setting up somebody as allies, it's because you want them to join in combat, as opposed to where I'm doing here, Raider faction, where I'm thinking, hey, I want the Raiders to be friendly here. Usually if you're setting up an ally, it's instead what you're saying is, I don't want my NPCs to attack them, but more importantly, I want my NPCs to jump in and help that side. That's kind of what you're saying. Rather than worrying about how they're going to react to you, you're almost setting up, how do I want my faction to work with that faction, but only in one direction. So for example, in our demonstration here where we have our KG test faction, let's say that we have that same scenario with the Minutemen and the Brotherhood in the room together with Raiders. And then we add all of the Minutemen to our KG test faction. What would happen is that the Brotherhood and Minutemen would be attacking the Raiders. Then they would get added, the Minutemen would get added to this test faction. They would see, oh, the Raiders are our allies. Let's stop attacking them. But the Brotherhood are attacking the Raiders, and the Raiders are our allies. So now we have to attack the Brotherhood. So we went from neutral to now they're attacking. Even though they're not technically enemies, they're still attacking because they're defending their allies. And this is where that AI data stuff comes in. So, so just know that faction relations are all one-sided. They have to specifically be designed to be reciprocal by putting them in, and that you shouldn't edit vanilla factions. And so if you want your NPCs to react reciprocally with a particular vanilla faction, you should just add your NPC to that faction or get into scripting stuff where you dynamically change this stuff. So for example, we could use a script to tell the Raider faction that they are allies with our KG test faction. And that's something, once we get into more scripting, you'll start finding that a lot of the stuff I teach you in the scripting tutorials, you'll be able to naturally just take that information and scripts you find in the Creation Kit or scripts you find on the creationkit.com site and figure out how to use that stuff. So I'm not going to be able to show you every single function and every potential possible use, because there would be hundreds of thousands. I mean, there would be literally infinite, but I could probably do 100,000 different individual script tutorials to teach you functions and how you might use them. So script before scripting, just add the NPCs to the faction is going to be your easiest way to deal with stuff like that. All right, so now let's go to the crime tab. So crime effectively is a way for the player to temporarily become the enemy to an NPC. By default, every NPC cares about themselves, and crimes are the obvious things: murder, assault, so attacking them, pickpocketing them, stealing from them. And then for a lot of Skyrim, you would see trespassing, where if you were entering their homes at night, they would consider that trespassing. It's not really a mechanic that's used in Fallout, though it could be. It's absolutely possible to set up trespassing in Fallout as a crime. But it does require specific work on a specific area to make that happen. So the most common ones are the other four: stealing, pickpocket, which I guess stealing, pickpocket, virtually the same thing, assault, and murder. Those are the crimes you're familiar with in the game, and basically they allow NPCs to temporarily become your enemy. So treated just like you were in their enemy faction as far as what their AI data is set up as, which we haven't covered yet. But the idea behind track crime, which is one of the things here, is that rather than an NPC acting independently, they will actually talk about their crime with all other members of that faction, regardless of whether they saw you or not, or whether they were in the area. Now, a thing to note about this is a lot of the stuff on this tab isn't actually used in Fallout 4. So all of this stuff here under jail, these select reference boxes and this drop down, none of this is used. This crime gold section isn't used. Arrest isn't used. So basically, if you're going to track crime, you're going to turn on attack on site. Without that, this doesn't do anything because there is no arrest option. So attack on site just basically means I'm going to attack you. That's how you get punished for doing crime. Another thing you might use is the shared crime faction list. This allows you to set up a form list of factions that should all track each other's crimes. So that way they all will respond accordingly, so that they will all work together in the same way. So then it's like those factions kind of all work as a unit as far as tracking crime. And crime making you a temporary enemy is one of those things that doesn't even really have that big an impact in Fallout 4, because crime is forgotten after 1 hour. So instead, what Bethesda opted to do with permanent crimes is they do at runtime, they basically change faction relationships. So for example, if they wanted to set it up so that after you murder 3 people of a faction, you're their enemy, that actually has to be scripted. That's not done dynamically. It's not automatic just because of crimes. All crimes are forgotten after 24 hours, which is one of those learning how the sausage made things that kind of sucks about getting into modding, because that makes the game world seem so much more ethereal and less permanent when you know you can just get away with stuff like that, and that's kind of a bummer. But it is what it is. So track crime, it tends to be that you want something like if the player gets caught stealing in the Pridwin, you want everybody else in the Pridwin to get pissed about that. That's kind of the behavior you're going for. So one thing with this ignore crimes, this is kind of tied in with the shared crime faction list. So let's say, for example, we want the Brotherhood or let's say we want the Minutemen, who are naturally friendly to all the random little farm factions. So their shared crime list, if we bring that up here, you'll see has like the Abernathys and the Finches and stuff. Let's say we only wanted the Minutemen to care if you murdered those people, but they don't actually care if you steal. Then checking in some of these boxes here will allow you to get away with some of the smaller crimes without having the enemy status come up. So that's what these ignore are. And then the do not report crimes against members. I'm trying to think of how this exactly works. So this one, I'm drawing a blank right now. It's actually really late at night when I'm recording this, so I'm not going to give you guys bad information. This is not very often used, though. But for the most part, when you're setting up this particular faction tab, largely what you're doing is you're saying, I want everybody in a faction in an area to all work together and not seem ridiculous that I can get away with doing something bad to one guy in the faction and the rest of them don't care if they didn't see it. That's kind of the idea behind it. Kind of almost like you're simulating that there's an alarm in the area is largely what you would do with the crime thing. Ranks and vendor, again, we're not going to cover that yet, but we'll cover that in a future tutorial. All right, so now let's go over to AI data. This is where all the magic happens, and this is what tripped me up for the longest time. And still trips me up today because there are a lot of quirks in Conqueror still where I just can't quite get it to work. Although most of those issues, if you've run into faction issues with Conqueror where NPCs seem to be attacking, that has to do more with sequencing of scripting more than actual of me not understanding the AI and faction data. And it's stuff that I'm constantly working to fix. But I do fully understand how these things relate. So I'm going to go over that. This is all documented on that AI data tab, but I'm going to go over it now for you guys anyway. So you'll see that there is an assistance tab. And if you look at this here, there's 3 types. There's helps nobody, helps allies, helps friends and allies. And this is one of those things where this is one of the few places where the distinction between friends and allies actually matters. Basically, what you're determining is when should this particular NPC jump into combat. And so most NPCs are set up as helps friends and allies. Occasionally you'll have them set up as just helps allies, or where they help nobody. You'll see a lot of like super neutral NPCs, like I believe Brahmin are set up as assistants helps nobody. When they're set up as helps nobody, basically what that is saying is I'm never going to jump into any combat at all unless I get attacked myself. Otherwise, I don't care. Do what you're going to do. So that's helps nobody. Helps allies is what you would think is basically if any member of a faction that I have an ally record to gets attacked, I'm going to jump in. Helps friends and allies means that if a NPC gets attacked that's in my ally list or my friend list, I'm going to jump in. That's what the assistance means. So then, so assistance is one of the most common places where things play out. Then the next most common things play out is with the aggression setting. So unaggressive means basically under no circumstances are they going to fight. So this is very rarely used. So you'd find that even most NPCs that you wouldn't see attacking, they're not going to have the unaggressive setting, because unaggressive just means I'm a complete coward. I'm never going to make any attacks. So that's very rarely used. Aggressive is actually the most common. So to me, when I first saw aggressive, I assumed that meant that they were going to be attacking. But in reality, the only time that NPCs will attack with aggressive is if the NPC is in an enemy faction, or if they're temporarily enemy treated like because they committed a crime. So aggressive is the one you want most of your NPCs to have. This just means that they're going to attack their enemies and they're going to ignore people who are neutral, ally, or friends. They're not going to act horribly against them. Now, what you'll find with most of the factions that are flagged, or that you would consider enemies. So if you think about the factions in the game that are enemies, you'd think about super mutants, raiders, mirelurks, those types of things, or the gunners, to the dismay of many. But those are all set as very aggressive, and very aggressive enemies will attack everyone who's not a friend and an ally. So that means they will attack neutral. And as I mentioned before, the way Bethesda approaches this is they tend to go minimalist, and I recommend going that same way as well, just for the sake of keeping a lot of the dynamic nature of the game alive. Is that because every enemy or every NPC is naturally neutral to every other faction, unless they're specifically specified otherwise, very aggressive tends to mean that they're going to fight a lot of NPCs. So any NPC that's not specifically in a faction that's allied, that they're considered allies with, they're going to attack if they're on very aggressive. So very aggressive is what most things that you would consider default enemies are set as. Frenzied is very rarely used. It tends to only be used with things like spells. And that basically makes it so that the enemy or the NPC will attack absolutely everybody. They'll attack their friends, they'll attack their allies, they'll attack anybody they see. That's what Frenzied does. So Frenzied is very rarely used by the default setting. It tends to just be something that happens at gameplay with magic effects, or I believe that's what happens if you use one of the perks to incite an enemy. I believe that they get switched to Frenzied. So I've mentioned before that at runtime you can change all of this, which can end up doing some interesting things. We end up playing with that with Conqueror a lot to dynamically change enemies into captives. It's not super reliable, unfortunately, with scripts unless the player stays in that area, and because if you think about we deal in some settlements with stuff that's happening at your settlements a lot, that you're gonna come and go from them, and so then these settings can end up getting lost. We're not going to get into that. That's something worth covering with a whole bunch of stuff on persistence, but this is where usually the issue is happening. So if you're finding NPCs are randomly attacking, it's almost always related to this fact, the fact that aggressives, most NPCs are aggressive, which means they're going to attack anybody who's an enemy, and then a lot of NPCs are very aggressive, which means they're going to attack just about everybody else. So if you're not sure what's going on, check your NPCs for this setting. Make sure you're on either aggressive or unaggressive, and you should have a lot better time there. The next one on this, we'll go over the rest of this AI data tab because I don't think it's worth creating a whole other tutorial for, is the confidence level. And this basically determines how likely they are to run away from combat. Basically, like how much health do I have to have left before I run away. Foolhardy will mean they will stay in combat to the death. This is what you'll find most NPCs in the game have. And then if you look at some of the more like civilian type NPCs, they're going to have less of one where they will actually pull out of combat, where they will stop fighting once they get to a certain point and they'll start running away. So the confidence setting can change that. This is something, if you want to look at the details, specifics of confidence, you can see right here has specific information about each of those. But the idea basically is to simulate when should they abandon the combat. Aggro radius behavior we went over with in the scripting 101, but essentially what this allows you to do is override a lot of these settings here based on certain configurations. So you can basically set them up to warn, which has to deal with warnings are set up as special dialogue options, so it wouldn't have an effect on everything. But you can basically set up like within a certain radius, this NPC should just attack no matter what, as long as that person is not in their friendly faction. So if we look at like a basic, let me find another record here. We're going to look at some of the general turrets that you find out in the world. So if you look at one of these records, so if you look at, let's see, turret tripod template here. If we look at their AI data section, you can see that they're set as unaggressive. And I had mentioned that that means they will never attack. The aggro radius behavior can override that. So by setting them to unaggressive, you basically, the turrets by default aren't going to try and engage super long range. The aggro radius behavior lets you control exactly where they're going to attack from. So that's primarily where that's used, but it's also occasionally used for example, if you look at the Asylum in Fallout 4, you'll see that they make use of this so that the enemies will talk to you in a certain way. If you get too close, you get a warning, and then as long as you leave, they will leave you alone. It's only if you continue to press or you get within a certain radius that they'll actually turn on you. So that's how that can be used. All right, next let's cover morality. So morality is pretty rarely used. It basically affects whether or not an NPC will comply with orders when you tell them to do something. So the ones that matter most would be any crime and no crime. Violence against enemies and property crime are not used very often, if at all. But no crime basically means they won't trespass or steal or attack allies, basically is what that means. They won't do any of those things that would trigger a crime flag if you order them to do so. Oh, excuse me. Whereas any crime is the opposite. If you have any crime set for the morality of an NPC, then no matter what you do as a player to order them to do, they'll comply. They'll happily steal for you. They will trespass if that's set up. They will attack friendlies. They will basically just do anything. Violence against enemies basically let's go to property crime first. Property crime means if you had this set, they would steal for you or trespass, but they wouldn't commit violence. Violence against enemies includes property crime, so it's basically everything below. So it's these two are done. So they would steal for you, trespass, and they would attack. But because it's against enemies, it means they would only attack enemies. And I don't like that would always be considered a crime, I guess, to attack an enemy because most of the factions would have track crime set up. So it's a very odd setting. I don't know what use that would hate. So I think 90% of your NPCs or 99% are going to have either any crime or no crime, whether or not you want them to commit crimes in the name of the player when they order some. And so that's the other thing is that this really only has a big impact with companions. There are cases where you're giving NPCs control to the player, but it's pretty rare. It would be things like when you use the, I'm trying to think of the name of the perk to take control of enemies, like the intimidation perk and things like that, where you actually take control of them temporarily. Outside of that, morality is not really used very much. Excuse me. Energy has to do with how frequently the NPC will change what they're doing in sandboxing, and I don't remember whether more energy means I think it's the more energy they have, the longer they will stick to an activity before they change. I might have that reversed though. It might be that the less energy they have. I'm pretty sure it's more though. More energy means they'll stick to each of their sandbox activities for longer. So if you want an NPC to be, stick around and do something for longer, you can mess with their energy level. Next up is the combat style. So combat style, this is one of those things where you can get really deep with, and I'll probably eventually do a full tutorial on combat styles when I fully understand it. But effectively, this is what controls how the AI acts in combat, whether or not they are focusing on melee or focusing on ranged, whether they like to flank you, whether they like to use cover much, or if they just run in like an idiot. So the different combat styles, but there's usually something will cover most of your needs under, if you go for most human NPCs, under the raider section. So they tend to have, like, so you can see here, all offense melee, normal melee, defensive melee, ranged accuracy. I think that's accuracy, which would be odd. That's why they would have accuracy listed there. But anyway, you have a variety of different, and maybe there is an accuracy control. I'm not super familiar with how the defining custom combat styles work, so some of these are off to me, but effectively you can find something that will work well for your NPC under here by default. If you want to get really deep into it, you can start creating your own custom combat styles, and then those will show up in this list as well. But this determines how they act in combat. That can be changed at runtime too, so you can actually dynamically change which combat style they use. You'll see that some companion mods use this to make their NPCs chill out and stand back, or actually run in and engage. You can kind of change that. And then gift filter, I don't believe is used in Fallout 4, and mood is definitely not used in Fallout 4. So that should cover that. So basically, the whether or not an NPC is attacking is going to be heavily determined on the aggression setting, which is going to be aggressive, meaning they're only going to attack enemies or when attacked. And then the very aggressive means they will also attack neutrals. And then frenzied means they will attack everybody. And then beyond that, it's assistance is when are they going to react to their factions? Are they going to join in on the fight with allies, or are they going to join in on the fight with friends and allies, or with nobody? And then determining who is neutral for the sake of very aggressive, who is an enemy for aggressive, who's a friend and who's an ally for assistance, is all determined on this general tab of the factions. So hopefully all that information together, you should start to be able to piece together how different things are working, or at least maybe now you'll have a clearer picture when you start reverse engineering how Bethesda does something when you're looking at why certain NPCs attack or don't attack. So hopefully that will help you guys. I would say that this, combined with the things like set faction and I believe it's set faction relation, those scripts, if you start toying with scripts, you can really do a lot of fine-tuned controlling, so you can have control. So if you look at something like Conqueror, I mentioned that we still have some issues where things don't seem to work out perfectly, where NPCs would attack where you wouldn't expect them to. That's more sequencing to do with my scripting more than actual faction relations. But you can see in there we've arranged so that you can have things like raiders actually live as friendly NPCs in a settlement, or a lot of the faction packs are doing that, and that is all controlled by combinations of the factions that are set up, and then the way we have our AI data set up. So you can really basically make any NPC friendly to any other, or enemy to any other, all at runtime. It's a very, very powerful system. And the big takeaways I would say from this tutorial are understanding how these aggression and assistance work, and you can refresh your memory on this AI data tab. Aggression. So right here, I will link this below, but this on the Creation Kit site, you always have this available to get that information so you can reference it. And then for the factions, of remembering that faction relations are not reciprocal. So just because you set an ally one faction doesn't mean that it's a faction the other faction is going to treat in kind. The fact that you have to you explicitly state that a faction is an ally to itself, so that faction members will work together. And then you should never edit vanilla factions. If you want your NPC or a player to be friendly to a faction, you should just drop them into that vanilla faction. Or at runtime, use a script to tell that other faction that it should be friendly to yours, and then you can define yours as friendly to it. So there's a lot to learn. It's a lot of it is just kind of playing around. You'll start to feel stuff out. What I would recommend if you want to get a great experiment would just be start setting yourself up. Set up a faction with set up yourself like a save file where you've got in your mod, say you go in and you drop 2 NPCs into the world, and you give one faction and one the other. And you just create 2 test factions and just start playing with the different combinations and see what happens, and watch your NPCs, how they react when you load into the game world, because they will immediately react to each other. And then you can start learning the different ways you can manipulate. That's the best testing I can imagine you could do, is set up 2 factions, experiment with what each happens with them when you set them as ally, enemy, neutral, and then in combination with the different AI attributes, and just watch it happen, and you will learn so much. All All right, guys, I hope this demystifies some of the faction stuff and helps you guys get past some of the issues I ran into when I was learning all these factions. If you want more information, go check YouTube for Creation Kit and factions. You'll find people like Dark Fox 127 and Seddon, who have done some tutorials where they've expounded upon things they've learned with factions. They might have covered some things that I didn't, and they can help you flesh out your knowledge of it. But a lot of it just comes down to just trial and error until it starts to click for you. So hopefully I shared some information with you guys that will get you past some of those humps.